All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first SFL webinar of our fall series. My name is Chelsea Cravey, and I'm the director of the SFL webinar series, as well as an executive board member. Tonight, we are honored to have Professor Dan DAmico deliver a talk on modern Austrian economics as Subaltern Studies. Before we begin, though, I want to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty for those of you who aren't too familiar with it yet. SFL is a 501c3 nonprofit organization run by students and for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed 4 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche in our universities, connecting liberty-friendly students with other like-minded students all around the world. We also connect students with faculty and organizations and resources to help them advance pro-liberty ideas on their respective college campuses. The resources that we offer include free books for student groups, handbooks on running student organizations, tabling kits, leadership training. We have an academic journal for liberty and society, and of course our conferences. The fall semester is the season for our regional conferences, so I encourage everybody to look on studentsforliberty.org to see where the nearest one is to you. The webinar series is also a resource that we provide for students, and it's a way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorship from wherever you are. We hold webinars every other week to put you in touch with the top scholars for liberty in the country. It's a way for people to hear these ideas if they might not come into contact with these speakers any other way. Tonight's webinar is with Professor Dan DAmico. Dr. Dan DAmico is an assistant professor of economics at Loyola University, New Orleans, and has received university awards for teaching, research, and service. His current research is focused on applying various political economy perspectives, including Austrian economics, public choice, and new institutional economics, to understand the processes of social change surrounding punishment and incarceration through history and the United States today. Before we start, just note that there will be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar, so feel free to type in any questions that you have for Dan in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can put it in while he's speaking or at the end during the Q&A time, but I will only be asking the questions at the very end. And for everybody interested, this webinar will be recorded and archived on our website in the next few weeks. So without any further ado, I present to you Professor Dan DAmico.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Chelsea. I would ask how everyone's doing, but in this format, it's really awkward to just hear silence. So let's just get started. I want to begin with the obvious disclaimer that I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert subaltern scholar. This is an area of research and literature that I have just been investigating within the last year or so. So I thought that I would begin with a bit of why I got interested in this literature as it relates to my research program more generally. I'm interested in the political economy of prisons and incarceration. So what that typically, the way in which I would define that would be what are both the causes that lead to particular trends in prison construction and or incarceration, and then also what are the consequences of those social phenomena? What subsequent effects do they have upon our society, our culture, and our economy? Now, as I've investigated those topics, I've come to realize that that question is inherently tied up with the way social sciences understand violence in society, in particular both sort of social violence like inter-individual violent conflict or crime on the one hand, as well as how governments or collective social groups or even individuals react to that violence, right? There's sort of a circular process involved there. So this question of violence in society is intimately linked to nation. And then lastly, both of these questions are intimately linked with the notion of political economy more generally. Mainly, most people define political economy as being a research project dedicated to understanding the proper role of government. And predominantly, no matter what sort of ideological background you are, a common thread amongst most ideologies is that the role of government is at least to promote social order by means of mitigating violence. And in most people's sort of presumed basket of tools to mitigate violence would be law and order institutions such as the prison system. So when I started researching on these topics from the perspective of economics, it was kind of unsatisfying. As a follower of Austrian economics and new institutional economics, more qualitative research methods, it didn't seem that many people who were on the one hand well versed in, say, rational choice, basic micro supply and demand analysis on the one hand, were also talking about incarceration, the causes and consequences. There were lots of models about optimal levels of punishment or efficient criminal justice institutions, but few economists were paying attention to the social patterns of incarceration. They definitely seemed less concerned about mass incarceration in contemporary America today compared to people in humanities or other forms of social theory, in particular sociology. So when I started reading outside of the discipline of economics to find answers to this question, I had to confront this guy down here at the bottom, this bald, creepy-looking dude, Michel Foucault. Basically, anyone who was anyone who wanted to comment on the history or social consequences or processes surrounding incarceration had to deal with Michel Foucault, because he writes this seminal book circa 1977 about discipline and punish. And so my first investigation into that work, I had sort of a negative reaction, in large part because I was reading it after I had read many people who had been inspired by it. In other words, I was reading contemporary writers who were constantly contextualizing their theories with regard to Foucault's. And much like exists with Adam Smith, much like exists with F.A. Hayek, there's usually like a cottage industry of people who really confuse the insights of major figures in any field. And I think that that's sort of the case with Foucault. So, for example, I've brought up a couple of links here for you guys to check out. This is Local Quaint's website. He's a major ethnographer, sociology guy who writes a lot about mass incarceration today and its causes and consequences. Similar to him, more theory-driven and more attuned to, say, the relevant institutions and cultural effects of mass incarceration. This is David Garland. He's at NYU. His major book here is Culture of Control. And then there's this guy, Bernard Harcourt, who has a very recent book, The Illusion of Free Markets. He's at Chicago alongside the Committee on Social Thought and the Becker Center. So he interacts with those guys a lot. What I would say is common and inspired my interest in Foucault and to sort of delve deeper into social theories of crime and punishment in these thinkers is that they seem to equate or claim that the rise of incarceration in, say, the modern period since the 1800s, for example, is inseparable from the rise of capitalism, industrialization, advanced material production, or global markets. And they sort of accredit this insight to Foucault. And I take issue with that. I take issue with it for a variety of reasons. One, I don't think that they are inseparable. I think that, in fact, we need to separate these issues. Two, I don't think Foucault argued necessarily that they were inseparable. I think that Foucault noticed this sort of what you could arguably say is a spurious correlation in time between these phenomenon that obviously had unique effects upon one another, but struggled with a social theory method and technique to overcome that what at first appeared to be very inseparable. So to give an example, or some further examples of this issue of equating these two things, it gets more explicit than this. Here are two papers that come to mind. The Market as Disciplinary Order, a comparative analysis of Hayek and Bentham by Massimo D. Angelis, and then another paper in the Southern Political Science Association, The Market as Prison. So both of these papers are basically saying that, like, this mechanism of discipline, the sort of calculative response of incentives through market prices is eerily similar to the specialized and individuated criminal sentencing panopticon style of enforcement that is designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, so scholars like Harcourt, for example, show these coeval historical processes of the rise of global markets and the rise of mass incarceration, and they sort of draw parallels from these things. Now, I really liked that Foucault seemed to be very much compatible with, like, a public choice understanding of power and government, right? He was not romantically saying that the state is this fantastic solver of our social problems, but instead was very concerned, like, wow, prisons were claimed to be this this sort of progressive humanitarian invention, but they actually created a rent-seeking or capture opportunity in the hands of the state. Foucault doesn't use that language of rent-seeking or capture, but basically his argument was that before prisons we had public punishments, we had spectacles, we had scaffolding, and things that were very viscerally torture, and so it seemed like, oh, prisons were this more sterile environment, this more machined and modern tool of more rational and reasoned humanitarian response. But in reality, putting the punishment process underground, behind the scenes, as opposed to sort of the public square, gave opportunities to governments to both degrade the qualities of those facilities, and also to get away with lengthening the amount and sentences. It basically took punishment out of the public eye, and this sort of had a problematic effect on incarceration. So I really like that aspect of Foucault. And secondly, me having just sort of been interested in the topic of incarceration, I mean, I was interested in incarceration because it was an arena of obvious state involvement, and I was very interested in the most sort of radical implications of libertarian scholarship, anarcho-capitalism, etc. And it didn't seem like there had been many people addressing the potentials for a private voluntary society to accomplish the functional services that contemporary prisons provide for criminal justice institutions today. And so in reading Foucault, I came across his description of why it is that prison populations, or even just looking at the concept of incarceration, was important, and he attributed it to this guy, Emile Durkheim, and the argument was pretty straightforward. Durkheim was basically saying that if we take social science seriously, that society churns and that there are processes of cause and effect that occur amidst different forms of social institutions and social behaviors, well, looking at something like the prison or looking at the types and magnitudes of punishment tells you something about how well or problematic the social machine, so to speak, is functioning. In your car, you would look at your filter. If you were cleaning a pool, you would probably also look at the filter. When animals are sick, veterinarians look at the stool in order to understand, well, what is sort of occurring in this process. If we look at prisons, to some extent, we can look at the populations, we can look at the magnitudes, we can look at the particular demographic makeups of what's inside of them, and hopefully reverse engineer some sort of explanation as to what's contributing to those populations in type and quantity and quality, etc. And so if you have these extremely unique phenomena occurring around your prison system, it tells you something about the operational features of your society. This was arguably the motivation for Learn Liberty. We recently made a series of videos. The first one was released. Hopefully some of you guys have seen it. Frustratingly enough, the comment thread on YouTube is actually falling into this trap, I think. Like, people are saying, well, why should we care about these facts just for the sake of them being facts? I think that there's sort of an inherent context of those facts, which would be that prisons by themselves represent a useful metric of understanding how society works or is failing. And this is something that Durkheim sort of noticed. And so I was really, I mean, to give examples, right? I mean, if you have mass incarceration, like Monday you wake up and the prison population, let's say, is like half of a percent. It's just some sort of normal amount around the globe, whatever. You're a normal country, you're incarcerating the same amount of people as everybody else. It's just a mild amount. You deter crime pretty well. Everybody gets along peaceably. There are some really heinous people, and they deal with them by prisons. And then Tuesday you wake up, and there's exponentially more people incarcerated. Well, any number of things could be going silly, right? On the one hand, it could be the fact that something's fundamentally wrong with the fabric of your civil society, that people have like gone crazy. They got like infected with like a zombie virus. They're raping, murdering, and pillaging each other. Or it could be that your enforcement regime has run amok, right? Like, you live in the Soviet Union and everybody's criminalizing everything, and that's also unreasonable. So again, looking at this would be sort of indicative. So again, for a long while, I had just sort of attributed this perspective to something Durkheim had said and something Foucault had picked up on, and great. And so within the last year or so, I was exposed by a former colleague of mine, Dr. Catherine Fidler, hat tip. I was really happy when I learned that basically this facet of Durkheim's thought of Foucault's project was inspired or actually sort of elaborated into an entire history research program called Subaltern or Postcolonial Studies. So to move on to for those of you participating in the webinar who I don't know, maybe know something about Austrian economics or maybe know something about Students for Liberty, but you don't know anything about Subaltern Studies, we should probably talk about what the hell that is. It's pretty straightforward. The notion of Subaltern Studies is that in the course of history, there are people who are dominant over others, and then there are people who are subordinate under those forms of domination. What subaltern studies is concerned with is the fact that if your historical data and perspective accounts do not recognize this reality of domination and subjugation, your sample of material to inform your understanding about the world is really biased, right? You're basically only paying attention to like old rich white guys, and you're not paying much attention to all of the populations of people who have been systematically oppressed over the course of society. So what sort of inspires much of the Subaltern Project, let me pull up this other one, was Antonio Gramsci. Now again, this is like particularly interesting from my research perspective. Gramsci gets incarcerated as a political prisoner in fascist Italy, writes a series of, I mean, it's like a treatise. I mean, for those of you guys who are interested in Austrian economics, if you think that Mises and Rothbard are badasses for writing these long books, Gramsci is a super badass because he writes a treatise in the confines of a prison that has to be like smuggled out in order to be published. I mean, trust me, Mises was like dictating to his pretty wife Margit, who was typing away on a typewriter, and Rothbard was like in an apartment in Brooklyn having a great time. Gramsci was incarcerated, miserable existence basically, and sort of twofold inspires the Subaltern Project. One is he explicitly outlines the theories of domination, subjugation in the colonial to post-colonial transition, but also the sort of context of producing this book is inherently attuned to these subaltern issues, right? Being incarcerated gave him a unique perspective on the functions of our society, and he ends up writing this massive treatise in social theory. So the three major facets of the Subaltern Project in this light are basically the importance of colonialism, the notion of subjugation and domination, and then in most recent manifestations, domination has taken the form of what's called cultural hegemony. So first, let's pay attention to this issue of colonialism. This is actually, again, a really interesting parallel for me, because what gets traced out in these literatures is that in the ancient world, right, we have something like chattel slavery, right, slaves to build the pyramids, etc. By the time you get to like Middle Ages, we're dealing with feudalism, right, which is definitely different than chattel slavery, but still problematic from the perspective of sovereign individuals, from the perspective of having there be power dominance and subjugation therein. In the wake of feudalism, we give rise to the colonial slave trade, which corresponds with globalization and global trade. Now, I think that that's particularly interesting in light of, like, this is Oxford History of the Prison. It's a fantastic book. Anyone who's interested, it's a series of chapters that are collected and edited by Norval Morris, David Rothman. David Rothman's an American prison historian. Norval Morris recently passed away. He's one of the preeminent global prison historians. But so they solicited all of these manuscripts to collect this volume, and then at the end of it, notice, if you look at the table of contents, it parallels this Subaltern Project, right? So it sort of traces, I mean, it helps people who are positive social scientists see the obvious similar characteristic features of something like chattel slavery or chain gangs sort of producing things like giant empire monuments in the ancient world into feudalism and the process of sort of indentured servitude that takes place there, and then also the process of colonial slave trade, and the notion of just sheer logistic maintenance of this many human beings, again, has this obvious logistic parallel to incarceration in its contemporary forms. So already what we see is that there's this parallel history between the history of domination, subjugation, the history of incarceration as a form of punishment, and then just the history of government, the history of the state. Again, so these are sort of like intertwined concepts. So colonialism, subjugation, this notion of cultural hegemony. My understanding of cultural hegemony was most informed by this book by, I'm butchering these names, Ranajit Guha. It's basically, this is what I consider to be the main sort of facet of the text. This diagram delineates between domination and subordination, basically. So there are those who would dominate others by means of persuasion, voluntary means, we could say, or coercion. Inversely, being subordinated, you can be sort of cooperative, or the word they use is collaborative, right? You can go along with the forms of persuasion or domination, right? Or you can be like reactionary or revolutionary or resistant. So what tends to happen in subaltern studies is that the project takes two sort of forms, right? The one question becomes, okay, if colonialism is now gone, what are the new forms of power that create subaltern populations, right? If you're going to do pre-colonial history, you just need to be attuned to the problem of power and subjugation. If you're going to do post-colonial history, it's not completely obvious who the dominant or the subjugated is, so we need some method to parse that out. Once we have an awareness of it, then we need a technique to effectively compensate for the biased narratives that get produced. So the two separate projects that tend to come up would be, okay, the obvious forms of coercion, like were most dominant in pre-colonial history, right, chattel slavery, feudalism, etc. And then in post-colonial history, there's a much greater emphasis on this cultural hegemony, the notion that by means of persuasion and collaboration or acceptance, forms of cultural hegemony tend to dominate over subjugated populations. This is where I think classical liberals, libertarians, or free market types, or Austrians, or whatever sort of like-minded folks in our network would butt heads with a lot of social theorists in this tradition, because we make these hard and fast distinctions between the voluntary and the coercive. This categorization, though sounds hard and fast distinction, it's a lot looser and fuzzier than what we're used to in our discussions. In other words, this inner sort of triangle is the bulk of a lot of their concerns, and the topical like fields that this tends to take place in are what we could call identity studies. In other words, the black studies, women's studies, gender theory, etc. Just as much as we have identity politics, the subaltern movement sort of lent way to identity fields of history, et cetera, that we've identified these particular demographics of individuals who were subjugated, and so we pay particular attention to them in historical and social theoretical analysis, and the major issues that plague them insofar as you're going to have this discipline of identity study no matter what if you're going to try to investigate it in a context that is very minimal in terms of conventional forms of power and subjugation, right? There is no chattel slavery in the United States for all intents and purposes. You're going to spend a lot more time focusing on cultural hegemony, for example. And so here I think is where the Subaltern Project has actually been a little bit problematic, but arguably the coolest insights that I think are coming out are like sort of admitting to this. So in other words, the two major insights that come out of these investigations, or this attempt in very positive terms to highlight the oppressed, has been the problem of overemphasis, right, which economists should understand pretty easily, right? Admitting that something is underprovided, right, does not give you carte blanche authority to just increase provision no matter what, because you can create the same forms of inefficiencies or problems from over-provision as you did with under-provision. So the question becomes, how do you hit the sweet spot of attention, right? If the Subaltern Project is motivated by under-attention to subjugated populations, how do you know that you're not putting excessive emphasis on these issues? And then secondly, I would argue is sort of a Hayekian in nature. It involves knowledge problems regarding authenticity. If you are a relatively well-to-do, higher education, fully tenured professor in the West, how is it that you in a meaningful way really understand the narratives or identity issues that plague people who have actually been suppressed on other parts of the world in other periods and times? So James Pataglione, for example, shout out James, hope you're watching, posted this article by a subaltern scholar, Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? This is the basic question of authenticity, right? You run the risk of recommitting the same form of domination over subjugated populations if you're talking for them, so to speak. And so her concern is very real and very a significantly legitimate one that I think, I mean, we see this all over today in terms of indigenous populations with regard to sweatshops, indigenous populations with regard to the selling of natural resources. It's like we have a concern about major corporations exploiting these populations, but then it's not necessarily clear that NGOs and like aid organizations have their best interests at heart either, or the problems with foreign aid, etc. Another great sort of challenge to the conventional approaches of subaltern was the introductory material in Habitations of Modernity by Chakrabarty. And what he's basically noticing is that a lot of the claims regarding cultural hegemony in factual history don't seem to pan out. So basically, what is the elephant in the room when you're talking about cultural hegemony? You're talking about money and power and cultural influence, right? The concern is that global markets, global financial interests are going to displace otherwise indigenous populations, that we're going to be a globe of blighted by unaesthetically appealing McDonald's. Now this is like just a caricature, but I mean you can imagine this being a legitimate concern. What Chakrabarty points out is that in the midst of significant growing engagement with global markets, places like India have not lost their cultural identity, right? New Delhi is not Cleveland. And I liked this essay a lot by him. It reminded me a significant bit of Virginia Postrel's introductory material to Substantive Style. She gives this whole explanation about how many countries in the Middle East are this great little petri dish where we can isolate the effects of, say, advertising, a form of an identified form of cultural hegemony, by looking at these environments that were they were devoid of significant mass media advertising for decades under particular regimes. And then when those regimes collapsed or left, it wasn't the case that everyone abandoned their religions and their cultural uniqueness. They did not throw off the shawl per se, but they did actualize and express autonomy as individual citizens through aesthetics, by like basically buying shawls with sparkles on them and stuff. Chakrabarty's essay gives a lot of that same sort of criticism of this cultural hegemony concern. So where is it here that I see a role of what I would consider modern Austrian economics to play in these questions and these concerns regarding domination, subjugation, etc.? As is common in social sciences, the sort of what I think Austrian contribution usually is that lots of people have identified very important and very good questions, and then in the investigation of those questions have admitted to an insufficiency of either resources or techniques or analysis to actually answer those questions. And the Austrian response to why these tensions are usually persistent or popular is an issue of methodology or how it is that we conduct social science. And again, this is something that I think more of the subaltern movement has become attuned to. A lot more of the readings that come out, it's less case study and more theory now. People are self-reflecting about the work that's been accumulated and how to sort of move forward in this research program. And so insofar as like Austrians have spent a lot of dead trees and ink and time and effort working on methodology and are now sort of getting into case studies and application, there's like this convenient inverse of comparative advantages between these two fields. So you're probably asking, what exactly do I mean by modern Austrian economics as opposed to just Austrian economics? For lack of a better word, I mean GMU plus. GMU, I have in mind Pete Leeson, Virgil Storr, Peter Becky, Chris Coyne, Emily Chamley Wright, even though Emily isn't at GMU, she graduated there. But I also mean plus insofar as I mean, in addition, add to that new institutional economics, development economics, and economic history. Now, why am I willing to include these three categories that are identifiable subfields of economics in and of their own accord? Why am I willing to call them Austrian? Is in large part because the people within them who I want to draw particular attention to are not representative of the dominant sort of forms within their disciplines. In other words, in new institutional economics, the people who I would be most interested in commenting on would be people like Diego Gambetta, who writes about the Sicilian Mafia, or Sudhir Venkatesh, who writes about underground economies. Development economics, again, I would draw a highlight to the colonial origins literature being done by Darren Acemoglu. That's not the dominant model of development economics necessarily that motivates foreign aid, that motivates public policy. It's not the dominant technique of like hyper-model crunching, predictive forecasting. Instead, they took these very sort of crude and cultural variables and investigated them. Now, in other words, what I think all of these authors, research program, modern Austrian economics is doing is we're paying attention to the hardest case. And this is sort of intentional, right? And it's at the heart of the Austrian methodology dating back to the dawn of classical liberalism. Like, so I wouldn't say that this is unique to GMU even. Any of you guys who are so interested can also check out my own sort of dabbling into these topics has been reserved to, let me find the page. First, I wrote a book review of Harcourt's book, which you can check out. Harcourt wouldn't identify necessarily as subaltern, but he's definitely one of these people who links the rise of capitalism with mass incarceration in the context of Foucault. Secondly, the new edition of Defending the Undefendable by Walter Block, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I mean it insofar as Walter's project in structure is very subaltern. He's saying that the people who are deemed criminal in our society, but who have not done anything to violate what, say, libertarians would consider the non-aggression axiom, or have not explicitly harmed other people, he's defending them. He's trying to give them a voice in Spivak's terms. In the introductory material to Defending the Undefendable, Rothbard and Hayek both comment on the fact that Block's the Walters presentation is fun and it's popular. It's actually very convincing and compelling because the cases are so extreme to many of the readers that if you can accomplish the extreme case, then sort of the marginal cases fall in line by default. And this process of having ideal type environments for social comparison is something that's built into the cultural commentary of Adam Smith and Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it's also built in to one of the originators of spontaneous order theory, Bernard Mandeville, in Table of the Bees. But it's also the general structured pattern that Menger is using in his Origins of Money, which is arguably like the methodological foundation of Austrian economics, and Hayek's descriptions of spontaneous order. So again, I wrote the new preface in Defending the Undefendable, and I'm trying to sort of flesh out these ideas. You guys should go on Laissez-faire Books to check that out. Essentially, in addition to hard cases and this potential to flesh out our understanding of how far you can push voluntary association, interaction, spontaneous orders without, say, state coercion, right? I mean, that is sort of an inverse subaltern project, is do we need the formal forms of subjugation that history has been plagued by at all? The second form of analytic technique in the Austrian tradition that I think is very good and very compatible, or at least should be looked at further by subaltern scholars, would be what David Levy and Sandra Peart, two historians of thought, call analytical egalitarianism. Analytical egalitarianism is this notion of political economy that economists in the tradition of Smith don't ascribe any unique knowledge onto themselves that the agents in their models that they're explaining don't themselves have. So if people are plagued by knowledge problems, if people are plagued by incentive problems, then chances are political makers and social theorists will also be plagued by those problems. And so a way to overcome these obvious potentials for bias in the not necessarily Austrian framework, but classical liberalism more generally, is just rational choice and basic property rights-based economics. Again, this like the notion of rational action, in a way, could be considered a forum for giving authentic voice to subjugated populations. There's sort of two remaining questions. One would be, how and why does the Austrian classical liberal tradition converge upon the similar theoretical arrangement as subaltern scholars? And two would be, why hasn't anyone sort of like noticed this and paid closer attention to it, and why aren't these two disciplines much more engaged with one another? To start with the first one, I think it's almost accidental. I think it's accidental that Austrians take on the same theoretical framework because, in large part, our object of understanding or subject matter is conveniently opposite to the Subaltern Project. In other words, Marx is trying to understand capital, and his argument is that it's expropriative, right? That there is inherent like thievery sort of going on in the context of capital accumulation and production. The Subaltern Project is presuming that people are being subjugated. It's not an unreasonable presumption to make, but it does commit you to a form of normative narrative that is difficult to maintain positive accuracy with. That normativity is conveniently avoided by, say, Hayek's research project, which is focused on paying attention to liberty and freedom instead of subjugation. In other words, the liberty that is the subject matter of Hayek's inquiry, you don't, by definition, the notion of spontaneous order, there's no one to blame for that liberty. So we can avoid like normative bias in analysis because you can describe the existence and functions of liberalism without drawing upon these sort of like winners, losers, good guy, bad guy type narratives. Marx, on the other hand, starting from the presumption of injustice, starting from the presumption of subjugation throughout the Subaltern Project, it's very difficult to escape some form of normativity, some form of these knowledge problems and authenticity, etc. Secondly, as to why we're coming across similar topics, is that within our own tradition, we have sort of our own iconic member akin to Gramsci, which is Tocqueville, and Tocqueville's influence on Hayek is explicitly commented on throughout Hayek's own writings. I've argued this in an article on the Mises website that I think, so in other words, the Tocqueville is sent to the United States specifically to investigate prison facilities. And I would argue that it is this juxtaposition of his observations of the prison facility with the civil society that he observes in the United States that inspires him to write Democracy in America, only after he produces his co-authored volume with Gustave de Beaumont on the penitentiary system and his applications towards France. Again, it's sort of a critical difference in the ways in which the classical liberal tradition has used comparative analysis and a desire to look at sort of underrepresented cases of social organization in parallel with the Subaltern Project, but tried very, very difficultly to maintain its identity as a positive social science in contrast. Now, the remaining sort of question of like why haven't these disciplines been talking much more to one another, I think is at the heart of one of the problems with this notion of overemphasis in the subaltern movement, mainly that, again, just as I was frustrated with reading so many people who equated the rise of capitalism with incarceration, I mean, to a large extent, if you understand scarcity, right, by increasing the emphasis that you're paying to a subaltern or subjugated population, by definition, you must be removing attention that you're paying somewhere else. And so in conjunction with highlighting underrepresented populations in the subaltern movement or post-colonial movement, there has been an intentional suppression of Enlightenment ideas. And I think one of the big issues that needs to be propagated in classical liberal circles is what Hayek points out is a very different thread, two competing threads of, say, individualism. There is one which he accredits to Bentham. It's a constructivist individualism, right, which is arguably at the heart of this concern regarding incarceration. Benthamite utilitarianism, right? Bentham thinks that we can quantify and calculate the concept of utility and believes it in such significant accord that he designs the panopticon as this measure of social reengineering. Hayek is explicit to say, like, look, this is the sort of bizarre version of the natural rights tradition that thinks that if order is natural and humans are natural, then humans are free to impose their rationalized or constructivist versions of order on society. In contrast to that, Hayek wants to refer to Tocqueville as representative of a more organic version of the natural order individualist perspective. That, yes, order is natural, but that's not to say that you can just sort of tweak it and manipulate it whenever you want. That the processes that lead to functional order in society are more organic and evolutionary as opposed to the brainchilds of ruling elites or something. So differentiating those two intellectual histories, I think, is very important, because the organic, evolutionary, spontaneous order, Tocqueville, Hayek wing got thrown out with the bathwater of constructivist rationalism amidst the Enlightenment. And I think that's this is a distinction that I'm trying very hard to write on and highlight in these literatures. It's very underrepresented. I mean, in addition to the sort of the papers that I showed you, the people who do that, what I would call false equating. But if any of you guys are interested or in the area of Fairfax, Virginia, Thursday, this Thursday, just day after tomorrow, September 20th, I'm presenting this paper, Counter-Revolutions of Criminological Science, which you can download the working draft on Pete Betke's website in the workshop in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics of George Mason. What this paper is trying to do is talk about or disaggregate these different intellectual traditions within the Enlightenment, that there is both, that there are separable theoretical traditions behind, say, Bentham and Tocqueville, and that a large part of the problematic features in society, both through history and today, surrounding mass incarceration, has been this over-methodological emphasis on the quantification of punishment through disciplinary apparatus, but there is an alternative understanding of how markets function in the Austrian tradition. To some extent, what I'm saying is that Austrians are a subjugated population in our own discipline, that if you take this insight of underrepresentation very seriously, we should take it seriously in the intellectual setting as well, that we're probably paying not enough attention to underrepresented ideas and over-attention to mainstream ideas in certain periods of time. It would be much more useful to reverse those trends, and that in economics one could arguably sort of see the patterns on the wall and the writing on the wall that this might be the case. So Chelsea, I guess I'll turn it over to you and open up for questions and answers.
Thank you, Dr. DAmico.
Welcome.
So Do you still have time to go over if there are a lot of questions?
Oh yeah, I've got nothing to do.
Awesome. Okay, so again, if you guys have any questions, there's a question tab on the control panel, and you can just type it in there, and then I'll read it out. So the first question we have is, doesn't any Subaltern Studies project presuppose a theory of justice? How can we say that a party is subjugated without asserting a theory of rights, justice, or morality?
Yes, I agree. I think that's a reasonable criticism. Now, presuppose a theory of justice, probably. Which theory of justice? Admittedly, I'm not sure. In other words, I don't think it necessarily, I mean, where a hostility would probably arise between your modal libertarian and your modal subalternist would be that the libertarian would want to sit there and talk about property rights and ownership and all these things, and the modal subaltern person would probably say something like, well, those are just Western ideas, man. Now, these are sort of cheap caricatures of both positions, because I think that there's a libertarianism that doesn't necessarily represent pure property rights super alles, and there's obviously a Subaltern Project that doesn't just dismiss everything in the Western tradition, and that's sort of what I think more discussion needs to take place on, that both of those caricatures are bad caricatures. That yes, we probably infer some modal, some vision of justice when we presume the existence of being subjugated. Absolutely. The question is, can we construct one that is still accessible for accurate historical analysis or positive social science? I think where Hayek meets Foucault is essentially a great way to have that conversation, because what's happening in the Subaltern Project is they're realizing how difficult it is to be objective on these topics, yet Hayek's material has found it comparably difficult to veer from talking about things like property rights or liberty. In other words, we're only now getting to the applications of, say, crime, underground societies, pirates, etc., in the GMU research program, because we've got more Austrian scholars doing good work and getting to flesh out an applied body of research after decades of focusing predominantly on theory.
Great. Okay. So the next question is, how do you think the patriarchic attitudes that are possessed by authoritative religions, in addition to the popular belief that there is an omniscient, judging deity, affect the institutions of enforcement and detention in our country?
Historically, that was very much an issue. In other words, the invention of penitentiaries, right? The root word there is penitence. The sort of puritanical notion of reflecting upon your sins and seeking salvation and all of that was very much imbued in the legal system at the time. Arguably, I mean, when you read, they're not very fun to read per se, but there are a growing amount of biographies and personal accounts of prison wardens. And I mean, it's scary from a libertarian perspective. Like we're concerned about checks and balances on government and stuff like that, and we advocate for things like decentralized authority. But in a lot of instances, the growth that we've seen in mass incarceration, what it's meant is that these like local wardens and sheriffs who, in the reality of their own personal imperfections, are oftentimes kind of kooky Jesus freaks who are pretty open about that. So, I mean, insofar as that aggregates across the whole phenomenon, yeah, I would say there is a lot of religiosity in our criminal justice and punishment processes today. I mean, you swear on a Bible when you're in criminal court.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, did you say that it's possible to escape normativity totally in the social sciences? The Subaltern Studies discipline has seemingly a Nietzschean perspective on narratives in the sense of whoever tells the most compelling story rules the world. It seems like substantial stories seemingly fall prey to this lack of an objective narrative. Here enters Foucault's project with regard to power and knowledge, which you seem sympathetic to. Could you please clarify your statements in this regard?
Whoa, that's a question. Okay. I am sympathetic to Foucault's project, right? I think there's lots of arbitrage to be made between Foucault and Hayek because they both pay so much attention to knowledge. Foucault tends to supplement knowledge with power, whereas Hayek supplements knowledge with functioning spontaneous order or liberty. Now, this Nietzschean aspect of who tells the most convincing story, I mean, I'm not terribly familiar with Nietzsche, but I mean that seems something that I like sometimes, and is growing popularity within the classical liberal free market econ movement. Russ Roberts, Dan Klein, Deirdre McCloskey, they're all very sympathetic to this perspective that like there is no such thing as like objectivity. All we should really just do is like be good applied political economists. If everyone wears their priors on their sleeve, then the engagement and competitive ideas marketplace sort of sorts things out. I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm also sympathetic to the fact that I think that what the classical liberal tradition really represents is something remarkable in the advancements of theory and method for doing positive or objective social science. There is something that gets revealed by contrasting comparable scenarios in positive terms. I think that this was what the classical liberals in that period were struggling with. I think it's what the Austrians struggled with that got sort of ignored in the post-war period, and it's something that informs a lot of the applied research that's going on by the scholars in the, say, modern Austrian movement that I mentioned. So I do think that social scientists are smart or good to be as positive and non-normative as possible. And I think that the majority of the frustrations or tensions that are being exposed by subaltern scholars in the Subaltern Project are in large part a result of needing a method to deal with normativity. I hope that answered that question. I'm not sure it did.
Can you give an example of a persuasive, collaborative domination subjugation? How is this hegemony demonstrably different from a voluntary society?
Okay, I'm not sure about the latter part of the question, but the first part was an example of the persuasive forms of domination would be, I mean, like, to some extent, I could imagine someone, again, sort of a bad archetype of a subaltern scholar, like looking at a Indian kid wearing a Lady Gaga t-shirt and saying like that this is problematic, that like because he's not wearing like a Bollywood t-shirt or something more authentic to his own time and place, that there is a cultural displacement going on there, right? Nothing coercive, right? Like some people might take issue with that there's nothing coercive going on, but let's say in libertarian terms, some purely voluntary production function produced the shirt and sent it to India, and some purely voluntary production process on his part consumed it. The question is whether or not there's choice and what scope of power and magnitude he has to protect his own culture. Now, I'm on the sort of like knee-jerk, crotchety libertarian side in this discussion insofar as I don't think that that's really a meaningful form of coercion or domination that should draw our attention as social scientists interested in understanding social change, let alone subjugation. Because when you compare it to what is taking place in the geopolitical world at the hand of militarist strategy by the state and domestically with regard to mass incarceration, kids in India wearing Lady Gaga shirts should be the last of our problems, is sort of like my personal take on that. I don't know how those perspectives would fit in these literatures, and I don't necessarily have, I don't know, good reason for believing that, but those are sort of my own opinions on that issue.
Okay. And would internalized misogyny be an example of cooperative or persuasive subjugation?
Ooh, I wish this person was still on, because admittedly, like, my familiarity with words like internalized misogyny is lacking. I'm the way in which I would interpret that would be like women who hate themselves, which, I mean, I guess only insofar as it was the result of non-coercive forms of culture would it be necessarily cultural hegemony. And in the history of, say, like a lot of what's alluded to through patriarchy is not always non-coercive, right? I mean, for like it's there is a significant, like, there's a significant sea change in how much emphasis is placed on subjugation by hands of formal institutions pre the colonial period compared to subjugation that's accomplished through cultural hegemony in the more modern era, right? I mean, it used to be that women didn't have the right to vote or didn't have the right to own property. Like, those are like coercive forms of domination. Whereas if you, like, issues like being compelled to wear makeup or high heel shoes or live up to certain social expectations of gender would be more cultural forms of hegemony. But again, I mean, I'm sort of less concerned as a libertarian, as an individual living in society, about cultural forms of hegemony. Which is, I mean, so part of the project and some of the papers that I'm working on is an attempt at giving theoretical and structural magnitudes in today's society to contemporary forms of coercive domination and contemporary forms of supposed cultural hegemony. So in other words, I think it's strange that people are so fearful of corporations, yet the ways in which the ways in which property rights are enforced by corporations in public space are subdued and restrained compared to the ways that we're observing police encounter Occupy Wall Street protesters. It seems to me that when people attempt to launch political protests in the public space, the way in which the state administers violence is very, very visceral and corporal. Whereas when people launch protests of a private nature against identifiable corporate entities, rarely do you see as severe forms of violence deployed, which makes sense in a basic sort of incentive public relations framework.
Okay, great. Do you think that Marx's description of how socially necessary labor time disciplines the worker to be competitive with other forms is a form of persuasion in that power paradigm?
Grumble. Not really, which admittedly is not a satisfying answer to this question. My frustration with the prominence of Marx on both capital theory and labor theory in not only the Subaltern Studies, but higher academy, is that Marx on these topics is factually wrong. And again, like, it's sort of a consequence of the tipping the scales, right? If you start from the presumption that there is injustice going on regarding the interests of labor versus the interests of capital, or class conflict, or whatever, then you need a theory of capital that fits all of those things. And so Marx's theory of capital is extractive. Well, what does that mean? Well, extraction means that one person benefits and another person loses. In today's context, we structure the way we go about building and informing our understanding of concepts like capital in a totally different way. We begin from the shared agreement about the empirical realities. Like, this is a large part of why economists don't intermingle or chat with that much these humanities disciplines. And I empathize a lot with comments that Deirdre McCloskey made on the Bleeding Heart Libertarian blog, where basically she was like, you people don't know anything about economic history. Like, we're having all of these discussions about social justice, social welfare, egalitarianism, etc., but they're devoid of the empirical, agreed upon, and uncontested facts of economic history. Capital has not been extracted. It's been productive and has grown and replicated itself around the world. Like these are empirical issues and objective, observable facts about this concept that have to be addressed in our definitions of capital. Yet, throughout these literatures, many of the sort of essays and books that I showed you guys, there's, in much the same way that historians have teleologies, there's like an econo-teleology, right? Like, what is my model of production and exchange in my broader social theory? And it's default Marx, and for more modern people, default Keynes. Yet, we could keep a lot of the complementary socio-institutional effects of these models, but sub in a better understanding or a different model of economics and get something I would think is much more attuned to the realities of our social world, right? In other words, if you eliminate the Marx from Foucault and sub in Hayek, I think you get something really cool. Or if you, like, Local Quaint waxes poetic explicitly about Keynes, and he's like, the Keynesian progressive project is so beautiful, and we've abandoned it in exchange for Chicago-style economics. And he talks a lot about, like, these inevitable causes of the business cycle being driven by animal spirits, et cetera. And I'm like, if your model of the business cycle was based on power concerns regarding the Federal Reserve and the missing knowledge associated with investment decisions in the Austrian framework, I think that you would have a much more internally consistent, like, globalized social theory. So yeah, I'm not sure if that addresses the comment about Marx, but again, I mean, I'm not a Marxist specialist in much the same way as I'm not a feminist specialist or a subaltern specialist for that.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that we have for you tonight. And thank you so much, Professor DAmico.
Chelsea, this was super fun. You're my favorite webinar host ever.
And you're my favorite speaker that I've had.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Yeah, thank you to all the participants and everybody who asked a question. I hope you can all continue coming back to our webinars and learn more throughout the year. Something that we like to do for people who want to continue the conversation or who might have a response to this topic is post a blog post. If you have something you want to write about that SFL could publish on our site, that would be great. If you would like to do this, you just need to email it to the person who manages our blog, who is Casey Given. His email is cgiven, C-G-I-V-E-N, @studentsforliberty.org. And on a final note, you'll all receive a follow-up email pretty soon where you'll find more detailed information about our next webinar. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Shermer of the Skeptics Society, and he'll be speaking 2 weeks from tonight on October 2nd, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern. But in this email, you'll also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar. It only takes about 15 seconds, and we'd really appreciate the feedback. And with that, I think we're officially wrapped up. Thank you again for the time this evening, and have a wonderful night.
The